Chapter 13. A Major Breakthrough. In the space of less than a year, the Prophet went through a number of events which were bound to influence his thinking with regard to what line he should follow in order to bring his call to success. First, with the death of his wife Khadija and his uncle Abu Talib, he lost all the support and comfort he was certain always to receive both at home and in public. Secondly, the failure of his trip to Taif, which aimed at soliciting outside support for his call, brought home to him the fact that except for his few followers, he stood literally alone in opposition to the whole world. Thirdly, his night trip to Jerusalem provided him with the true perspective with which he should view all situations. It brought added clarity to his vision of where true power lay in the confrontation between true faith and its enemies. Reviewing his situation in Mecca, the Prophet realized that he was locked in a stalemate in his town. Although new converts to Islam were still trickling through, a major breakthrough seemed as remote as ever. Attitudes hardened, and well-entrenched tribal loyalties constituted a stumbling block, preventing many people who would otherwise be expected to think clearly from making a rational and objective assessment of what Muhammad, peace be upon him, was calling for. The only alternative, then, was to try to achieve the breakthrough away from Mecca. The emigration to Abyssinia and the trip to Taif may be viewed as two steps in that direction, although their immediate objectives were vastly different. Moreover, the Prophet repeatedly tried to make the most of the pilgrimage season, approaching pilgrims to explain to them the fundamental principles of Islam and invite them to accept it and convey its message to their own people. Although some of those pilgrims responded favorably, there were too few to bring about any change in the Muslims' general situation. These approaches should be seen as a consistent attempt to break the deadlock. Indeed, the pilgrimage season seemed to offer the best chance to carry the message of Islam beyond the narrow boundaries of Mecca. His trip to Taif proved to the Prophet that it was too risky for him to venture outside without first securing a strong base from which to operate. Approaching individuals, however, did not seem to be the answer. A change of emphasis was apparently needed. When the next pilgrimage season arrived, the Prophet started to implement his new approach. Pilgrimage to Mecca had been a yearly event ever since Abraham, peace be upon him, built the Kaaba on God's own instructions. Over the years, however, many irreligious practices and rituals had crept into the pilgrimage. These were later to be stamped out by Islam. Making use of the pilgrimage season. The Prophet now approached the pilgrims from the major tribes of Arabia. Naturally, they formed their own groups and remained together throughout their stay in the area of Mecca and Arafat. The Prophet went and addressed the pilgrims from each tribe as one group. He explained that he was a messenger from God entrusted with his message to call on people to worship him alone and to abandon all other forms of worship. The Prophet also asked every tribe he approached to provide him with protection so that he might be able to convey his message to mankind. Previously, the Prophet had approached individual pilgrims in the hope of winning new recruits. Now he approached tribes for an alliance which could give him freedom of action. Obviously, the Quraysh, who begrudged the Prophet even the slightest gain he was able to make as a result of his previous efforts with the pilgrims, could not sit still now that his approaches took on a collective form. His own uncle, Abu Lahab, who had always been a fierce enemy of Islam, took it upon himself to mount a counter-campaign in order to dissuade people from listening to Muhammad, peace be upon him. The following account is from Rabia ibn Abad from the Dil, a branch of the major tribe of the Kinana. I was a teenager accompanying my father in Mina, where pilgrims encamp after Arafat, when I saw the messenger of God coming to the quarters of Arab tribes. He addressed each tribe by their name and said, I am God's messenger to you. He commands you to worship him alone and to ascribe to him no partners whatsoever. He also commands you to abandon all those idols you worship in preference to him, and to believe in me, and accept what I say, and to protect me so that I can convey the message which God has entrusted to me. Behind him stood a cross-eyed man with a beaming face. his hair in 2 plaits, wearing an Adnan garment. When the messenger of God had finished what he had to say, the other man addressed each tribe by name. What this man is asking you to do is to abandon Al-Lat and Al-Uzza, their 2 principal idols, and to abandon your allies of the jinn in order to follow his craze. Never listen to him and never obey him. I asked my father about the man contradicting the Prophet, and he told me that he was his own uncle, Abu Lahab. The Prophet's attempts to win support from other tribes was opposed by all the vigor the Quraysh could muster. However, he continued to address his message to every tribe which could afford him the protection he needed to carry out his task. This meant, in effect, standing up to the Quraysh and going to war with them, which was bound to happen. Hence, it was not surprising that there would be no great enthusiasm among the Arab tribes to take up the Prophet's offer. The Kinda delegation, headed by a man called Mulay, were not the only ones to give the Prophet a blunt refusal. The tribe of Bani Amir ibn Sasasa were initially less negative. One among them, called Bihara ibn Firas, said to his fellow tribesmen, "If I take this Qurayshi man, I will be able with him to subdue the rest of Arabia." He then turned to the Prophet and asked him, "If we accept your call and give you the support you need, and if you then, by the will of God, are victorious, would we be rulers after you?" The Prophet answered, "Power belongs to God. He gives it whomever He wills." The man said, "Are we expected to fight the whole of Arabia to support you? Then when victory is achieved, we hand power over to others? We will do no business with you." When their delegation arrived back home, they related to their elders as usual the events of their journey. When they told them about their encounter with the Prophet and their reply to him, an old man who enjoyed much respect among them raised his hand to his head in disappointment and said, "Is there any way to rectify this mistake? By him who holds my soul in his hands, no Ishmaelite has ever made a false claim of this type. The man is genuinely a prophet. Where had you left your reason when you met him?" The affair, however, came to nothing. The Hanifa tribe, on the other hand, gave the Prophet a very nasty reply. Rejection was also the answer of Bani Kalb. Neglecting no individual. The Prophet, however, did not limit his approach to delegations of other tribes. Every time he heard of the arrival in Mecca of any man who enjoyed a position of respect among his people, he would approach him and explain Islam to him. In these cases, he did not ask for protection. He made that request only when he spoke to a tribe collectively. One such man was Suwaid ibn al-Samit from Medina. When the Prophet spoke to him, he said, "Perhaps you have something similar to what I have." When in response to the Prophet's request, he quoted some passages from a book he called Luqman's Magazine. The Prophet said, "This is certainly good, but I have something better." He read him a passage from the Quran and invited him to become a Muslim. Suwaid made no comment other than, "What you have read is certainly good." However, he was killed shortly after his return home. His people believed that he actually embraced Islam before his death. Another group of people from Medina, led by a man called Abu al-Hasir Anas ibn Rafi, arrived in Makkah seeking an alliance with the Quraysh against the Khazraj tribe in Medina. The Prophet went to them and said, "I can offer you something better than what you have come here for." In answer to their questioning, he replied, "I am God's messenger to mankind. I call upon them to worship God alone, associating with Him no partners. He revealed to me His book containing His message." He further explained the principles of Islam and read them a passage from the Quran. A member of the group called Ilyas, who was still a boy in his teens, said, "By God, this is better than what we have come here for." His leader, Abu al-Hasa, took a handful of sand and threw it in Iyas's face, saying, "Leave us alone. We have come here for a different purpose." The Prophet then left them. Soon after their return, the Battle of Buath broke out between the 2 Arab tribes in Medina, the Aus and the Khazraj. Iyas soon died, and those who attended him at his deathbed reported that he glorified God and praised Him until he died. They had no doubt that he was a Muslim. Cases like those of Suwaid and Iyas served as encouraging signs for the Prophet. An even more encouraging one was the case of Al-Tufail ibn Amr, a leader in the Daws tribe. When he came to Mecca for pilgrimage, the Quraysh elders made sure to warn him against the Prophet. They went as far as requesting him more emphatically not to meet the Prophet or listen to what he said. Al-Tufail reports, "They continued to pressurize me to the extent that I made a firm decision that I would never listen to anything he said, nor even speak to him. When I went to the mosque, the following morning I put cotton in my ears, so that I did not accidentally hear anything he said. I simply did not want to listen to him. Nevertheless, he was praying only a short distance from me when I was in the mosque, and God simply wanted me to hear his words. I recognized that what he said was certainly good. I said to myself, 'You are certainly on the wrong track. You are a good poet who could distinguish good words from bad ones. What prevents you from listening to this man and judging what he says? If it was good, you would accept it, and if it was bad, you would leave it.' I waited until God's messenger went home and followed him. I said to him, 'Muhammad, peace be upon him, your people have said to me this and that, and warned me most emphatically against listening to you until I closed my ears to anything you said. Yet God wanted me to hear what you say, and I found it good. Will you please explain your message to me?' The Prophet told me about Islam, explaining its principles, and recited a passage from the Quran to me. By God, I had never heard anything better than that. I immediately adopted Islam and declared my belief in God's oneness and the message of Muhammad, peace be upon him." When Al-Tufail arrived at his tribe's quarters, his father, an elderly man, came to greet him, but Al-Tufail told him that they no longer belonged together since he had adopted Islam and followed the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. His father declared that he would follow the same religion. Al-Tufail told him to have a bath and wash his clothes. When he had done that, he explained the principles of Islam to him, and his father became a Muslim. Al-Tufail did the same with his wife, who was also ready to adopt Islam as soon as its principles were outlined to her. He started calling his people to Islam, but they were not ready to respond to his call. After some time, he felt downhearted, and he went to the Prophet, complaining of the slow response. He suggested that the Prophet curse them. Instead, the Prophet prayed for their guidance and instructed Al-Tufail to go back and call on them gently to adopt Islam. He went back to act on the Prophet's instructions. He did not see the Prophet again for several years until the Battle of the Moat had taken place. He traveled with about 80 families of his tribe who adopted Islam. They joined the Prophet at the Battle of Khaybar, and the Prophet gave them shares of the spoils of that particular expedition. The people of Medina. The city of Yathrib, now known as Medina, meaning the city, was inhabited at the time of the Prophet by two major Arab tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj. These two tribes had a long history of bloody wars which sapped their strength. The last of these battles, named Bu'ath, took place about 2 years before the events we are now relating. A large Jewish community had lived in Medina for well over a century. All history books agree that the Jews were instrumental in keeping the two Arab tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj, at each other's throats. Historians also relate that the Jews came to Medina because their sacred books mention it as the place where the last messenger from God was to establish his state. Like the rest of the Arabs, the Aus and the Khazraj were idolaters. In common with all Arabs, they revered the Kaaba and offered pilgrimage. In a pilgrimage season after the Prophet had adopted his strategy of speaking to the various Arab tribes, seeking their protection in his fulfillment of his mission, a group of 6 men from the Khazraj tribe were offering the pilgrimage. The Prophet met them at a place called Aqaba at Mina, where pilgrims encamp for 3 days. When they identified themselves to the Prophet, and he ascertained that they were the neighbors of the Jews, he sought to explain his message to them. They were willing to listen to what he had to say. The Prophet outlined to them the principles of his message and read them a passage from the Quran. He called on them to believe in God as the only deity to be worshipped. Some of them said to the others, "You may be sure that he is the Prophet with whom the Jews keep threatening you." Let them not be the first to follow him. That apparently touched a sensitive nerve with them. The Arabs of Medina used to respect the Jewish religion. They recognized that their own pagan beliefs stood no comparison with the monotheistic religion of the Jews, who professed to have better knowledge of God and man. Every time the Arabs of Medina clashed with the Jews, the latter would say, "It will not be long before a new messenger shall be sent by God. We shall follow him, and we will kill you all in the same way as the peoples of Ad and Iram were killed." The 6 Khazrajis did not hesitate to accept what the Prophet said. They were Asad ibn Zurara, Auf ibn al-Harith, Rafi ibn Malik, Qutbah ibn Amir ibn Hadida, Uqba ibn Amir ibn Zaid, and Jabir ibn Abdullah ibn Riyab. They declared their belief in God and the message of Muhammad, peace be upon him. They also said to the Prophet, "We have left our people in an unprecedented state of mutual hostility. May God make you the cause of their unity. We shall call on them to follow you and explain to them your religion which we have accepted. Should God unite them in following you, you shall enjoy with them a position of the highest prestige." Thus the Prophet had 6 emissaries who carried his message to their own people. They were apparently very active emissaries. In no time, the whole of the city was speaking about the Prophet and his call. Many accepted Islam through the efforts of these 6. It was clear that Medina was the most fertile environment for Islam to spread. In the first place, it was free from any hostile feelings like those which existed in Mecca. Hence, Islam, with its clear and simple logic, had a great appeal among its inhabitants. Secondly, the monotheistic idea was particularly appealing to the Arabs of Medina, owing to their respect for the Jewish religion. Some historians see the arrogance of the Jews in Medina as the only thing which prevented its Arab population from converting to Judaism. The Jews behaved in a condescending manner towards the Arabs and showed them that Judaism was the religion of the elite only. Moreover, the embattled Arabs of Medina yearned for a life of peace. It was not easy for the 2 tribes of Aus and Khazraj to achieve a lasting reconciliation without a powerful catalyst. It is obvious from what the 6 said to the Prophet that they hoped he would be the catalyst of peace and unity. With Islam making such headway very quickly in Medina or Yathrib, converts longed to meet the Prophet. The obvious time for such a meeting was the next pilgrimage season, when the original 6 were joined by 6 more to meet the Prophet at Aqaba. The Prophet was very pleased with the enthusiasm shown by this delegation for the cause of Islam. They were very keen to do their utmost for the new faith. The Prophet, however, did not ask them at that particular stage for protection as he used to ask other tribes. A shrewd statesman, he recognized that such a pledge would come at the right moment, without him asking for it. The immediate necessity was to consolidate the new base in Medina. Hence, the Prophet entered into a covenant with the 12 men, 10 from the Khazraj, the other 2 belonging to the Aus. The terms of the covenant meant that the 12 pledged themselves to worship no deity other than God, to commit neither theft, nor adultery, nor child murder, to utter no monstrous falsehood of their own invention, and never to disobey the Prophet over anything which was just or reasonable. This covenant came to be known later as the Covenant of Women, for its terms continued to apply to women only. Men had to add a pledge to fight the enemies of Islam. This pledge of support was a very important breakthrough in the history of Islam. The terms did not include any military provisions, but the need for those was not yet pressing. It was enough for the time being that Islam should be able to establish its roots in Medina by the recruitment of more people. After all, Islam does not like to go to war unless it is absolutely unavoidable. Although the Prophet realized that the Quraysh would not let Islam move freely in Arabia without trying to silence it by all the means at its disposal, such a confrontation was not yet imminent. Hence, the pledge included what could be termed the Islamic Peaceful Program. The Prophet sent Musab ibn Umair to Medina with his new followers. His mission was to educate the new Muslims in Medina in their new faith, to teach them the Quran and all they needed to know about Islam. He was to call on people to adopt Islam. He also led the Muslims in Medina in prayer. As the memories of the most recent battles between the two tribes, Aus and Khazraj, were still fresh in their minds, neither group found it easy to be led in prayer by someone from the other tribe. Musab was therefore the perfect choice. He also had an additional task: to study the situation in Medina very closely and to make an assessment of likely reactions in all eventualities. The Prophet would then be able to make the decisions he had to make on the basis of first-hand information. Winning influential recruits. Musab ibn Umair was a dedicated worker with the right temperament to mix with strangers and invite them to adopt Islam as a religion and a way of life. He was also to assess the general situation and the feasibility of an exodus of the Meccan Muslims to Medina. He might also have had further instructions. It is noticeable that in the contracts that had taken place so far between the Prophet and the people of Medina, the tribe of Khazraj figured more prominently than the Aus. This is probably due to the fact that the first 6 who met the Prophet and accepted Islam belonged to the Khazraj. It was only natural that they would concentrate their efforts within their own tribe. Hence, it was not surprising that the 12 who entered into the covenant of support with the Prophet the following year included 10 from the Khazraj and only 2 from the Aus. Hence, Musab might have been instructed to try to redress this imbalance. The last thing the Prophet wanted was that Islam should contribute to the division among the people of Medina. He was eager that Islam should be a unifying force. Musab stayed with Asad ibn Zurara, a Khazraji with immediate relatives from the Aus. Asad supplied him with all the information he needed about the people of Medina. One example of the main achievements made through their joint efforts is perhaps sufficient. One day, Asad took Musab to an orchard which belonged to the clan of Abdul Ashal, a branch of the Aus tribe. They were joined there by a few Muslims, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh and Usayd ibn Hudayr, the 2 most prominent figures of that clan. They were still following the Arabian version of paganism. Learning about the presence of Asad and Musab, Sa'd addressed Usayd, "Go to these 2 men who have come here to spread their ideas among our simple people and tell them not to come to us again. Had Asad not been my own cousin, I would have spared you the trouble. As it is, I feel somewhat uneasy about turning him away myself." As Usayd approached the 2 men, Asad said to Musab, "This man is the chief of his people. Make a sincere effort with him." Musab answered, "I will certainly try if he agrees to sit down with us." Usayd adopted a tough attitude, making plain his objection to their approaches to the simple people. He followed that with a threat. "Stay away from us if you care for your own safety," Musab said. "Would you like to sit down with us and listen to what we have to say? If you find it reasonable, you accept it. If not, we will not bother you with it again." Usayd said, "Fair enough." As Musab explained the basic principles of Islam and recited a passage from the Quran, Usayd's face shone with admiration. When Musab had finished, he said, "This is a fine word indeed. What do you do if you want to adopt this religion?" Musab explained, and Usayd immediately made the necessary ablution and declared that he believed in the oneness of God and that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was his messenger. Usayd then said, "I am sending you a man who would be joined by all his people if he decided to follow you. He is Sa'd ibn Mu'adh." As Usayd drew nearer to Sa'd, the latter remarked that a total change had come over Usayd's face. Usayd, however, reported to him that he did not find the 2 men doing anything bad. He also reported that another clan were plotting to kill Asad in order to get at Sa'd himself. Angry, Sa'd said, "I will go myself and tell them to keep away from us." As he drew closer to them, he suddenly realized that Usayd wanted him to speak to them. He, however, started with some harsh words. Musab made the same offer he made earlier to Usayd. Thus, Sa'd sat down to listen as Musab explained the basic principles of Islam. Musab and Asad realized that they had won over their man long before he uttered a word. The expression on his face as he listened to the Quran said it all. As Musab finished, Saad indicated his acceptance of Islam. Going back to his people and joined by Usaid, he knew exactly what to do. He simply addressed his people, asking them, "What is your opinion of me?" They answered, "You are our master and the wisest of our men." "Then take this from me," he said. "I forbid myself all communication with you, all men and women, until you believe in God and His Messenger." That very evening, every man and woman of the Abd al-Ashal clan became a Muslim. Innovative ways to win new recruits. Needless to say, the new converts to Islam in Medina were very enthusiastic about their new faith. They realized that as believers in the oneness of God, they were starting a new stage in their history in which faith was the prime mover. They had a mission to fulfill. Their immediate task was to win new recruits to the new faith so as to consolidate its base. Hence, they were very active in preaching the message of Islam. They were particularly keen to win new converts among those who commanded respect and were influential among their people. One such person was Amr ibn al-Jamuh from the clan of Salama. A few young Muslims of his clan were keen to persuade Amr to join them, but he was an old man who could not easily respond to a call which would necessitate a radical change in his life pattern. The young men of Salama recognized that they must think of a method which would bring Amr face to face with the fact that Islam was a far better religion than idolatrous beliefs. As already discussed, throughout Arabia, the worship of idols was the recognized religion. People did not stop to think that their idols, which were made of stone or wood or gold or other materials, were of no use and no benefit to them. Following in the tradition of men of honor in Arabia, Amr had his own personal idol, which was made of wood. He kept the idol in his room, where he glorified and worshipped it. The young men of Salama decided to make Amr's idol their target. When Amr was fast asleep, they would enter his home and take the idol away and throw it into some hole full of dirt. In the morning, when Amr woke up and discovered the loss of his idol, he would start looking for it. He took the idol out of the hole it was thrown in, cleaned and perfumed it before putting it back in its place. The same thing happened day after day, and Amr was irritated, but he did not know what to do. He apologized to the idol. "Had I known who did this to you, I would certainly punish him severely." After a few days, just before Amr went to sleep, he took his sword and gave it to the idol, putting its strap around the idol's neck, and said, "I have no idea who abuses you at night. If you are of any use to yourself, then defend yourself against their assault. You have got the sword now." That night, when the young men of Salama saw the sword with the idol, they took the idol, tied it to a dead dog, and threw it into a disused well where people threw their dirt and litter. In the morning, Amr looked for his idol. When he found it after a long search, he was really shaken at the sight. His son and the others who were administering this treatment to the idol spoke to him and pointed out that if the idol could not protect itself, then it could be of no use to anyone. When they outlined the message of Islam to Amr, he accepted it without hesitation. He composed a fine, short poem describing the idol and its uselessness. He also praised God for enabling him to see the truth of Islam. Musab ibn Umair, the Prophet's emissary to Medina, returned shortly before the next pilgrimage season. He reported to the Prophet the good news that there was hardly an Arab household in Medina which did not have at least one Muslim among its members. He further reported on the composition of the population of the city. Full assessment of the Medina situation. Musab's report was carefully considered in order to establish whether Medina was a suitable place for the establishment of the first Islamic state. The first covenant the Prophet made with the people of Medina required them simply to live as Muslims by themselves. It did not include any provisions for dealings with other communities and states. Now it was time for a decision on this aspect. On the basis of the information supplied by Musab, The Prophet recognized that apart from the Muslims from both Mecca and Medina, there would be two groups of people in Medina. First, the Arabs who had not yet joined Islam. They had their own divisions, but there was scope for Islam to make further inroads into their ranks. There would obviously remain a hard core of resistance to Islam, but it should not pose much of a problem as time was on the Muslim side. Secondly, there were the Jews, whose attitude to the new religion was not yet known. Muslims must be prepared for all eventualities on that front, but they should not be the first to take a hostile attitude. They should strive to establish good neighborly relations. The Muslim community would also have an economic problem which would need urgent attention. The immigrants from Mecca would arrive in Medina without any money. They would need housing and jobs. Moreover, the Prophet also recognized that the new state to be established in Medina was bound to face an immediate external threat. The Quraysh in Mecca were not expected to sit idle while the new challenge to supremacy in Arabia developed and took shape. Certain features made Medina particularly suited to host the new state which was just about to emerge. Its natural fortification was unique. On both eastern and western sides of the city, there were two extended areas with volcanic stones which could not be traversed by man, horse, or camel. It was practically impossible for an attacking army to go through these areas. Only its northern front offered access to an army because on all other sides there were thick plantations and a countless number of date trees. It should perhaps be mentioned here that it was in the north of the city that the Prophet and his companions dug the moat to fortify the city further when 5 years later a great concentration of tribes marched to Medina with the declared aim of eradicating Islam altogether. From the military point of view, then, Medina was easily defensible. A small number of guard units was enough to intercept a large army and to stop its march. From another point of view, the Arabs of Medina, Aus and Khazraj tribes, were known for their pride, integrity, bravery, and high standard of military excellence. They were never subjugated by an attacking enemy, nor did they have to pay any tax or tribute to an occupying force. Any individual or small tribe who enjoyed the protection of the two Arab tribes of Medina felt very secure. The two tribes were considered, according to Arabian traditions of the time, as maternal uncles of the Prophet. His grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, was born to a woman from the clan of Al-Najjar of Medina, known as Salma bint Amr. Abdul Muttalib was born in Medina and lived there until he almost reached adolescence. The two Arab tribes in Medina belonged to Qahtan, while the Muslims of Mecca belonged to Adnan, the two main groupings in Arabia. Indeed, every Arabian tribe belonged to either one of these two divisions. When the Prophet settled in Medina, his supporters belonged to both groupings. However, any possible quarrel between them was prevented by the fact that they were now Muslims. The Prophet was definitely aware of all this when Musab reported to him on his mission in Medina. One can feel his awareness in his careful planning of his future steps over the next year or so. The immediate decision, however, was taken to the effect that Medina offered a suitable place for the establishment of the new base of Islam. The first step was to meet the new followers. A meeting was fixed for the last night of pilgrimage at Aqaba. This was probably the most important meeting in the 13 years of Islam in Mecca. 73 men and 2 women from Medina attended in the middle of the night. When everyone was fast asleep, those believers came out of their tents quietly in ones and twos to keep their appointment. The Prophet was the only Muslim from Mecca to attend. He apparently had to confide his plans to someone very close to him. This was his uncle, Al-Abbas, who was not yet a Muslim. Al-Abbas was the only non-Muslim to attend the meeting. He wanted to be sure that his nephew was on a safe course. A pledging of unwavering support. Al-Abbas's presence and his speech, which opened the proceedings of the meetings, must be seen in the light of the future development of relations between the state yet to be born and the Quraysh. What was about to take place was a radical realignment of loyalties. In the tribal society of Arabia, that was very serious indeed. Al-Abbas began by stressing that the Prophet's clan had so far fulfilled its obligations according to the prevailing social values. You know how highly we rate Muhammad, peace be upon him. We have protected him against our own people, with whom we share the same opinion of his call. He is indeed well protected within his own people and in his own city. Nevertheless, he is determined to join you. If you feel that you will indeed fulfill your pledges to him and will indeed protect him from his enemies, you are welcome to do as you please. Should you, however, feel that you may let him down after having taken him away to your city, it would be better for everyone if you decide here and now to leave him alone, for he is well looked after in his hometown. They answered him, "We have truly understood what you have said." They then turned to the Prophet and invited him to lay down his conditions. The Prophet began his short speech by reading a passage from the Quran. He then explained the message of Islam and its profound influence on the lives of its followers. He concluded with this very brief statement of the conditions of the pledge he wanted from them. You pledge to me that you will protect me as you protect your own womenfolk and your own children. Al-Bara ibn Marur, a leading figure among those present, said, By him who has given you the message of the truth, we will defend you as we defend our women. Take up our pledges, for we are the children of war and the best people with arms. The distinguished figure of Abu al-Hatam ibn al-Tahyan intervened here. We have relations with the Jews which are now bound to be severed. If we live up to our pledges and God grants you victory, would you, Messenger of God, leave us then to return to your people? Smiling, the Prophet assured him that he would not do that. He said, I belong to you as you belong to me. I fight your enemy and make peace with your friend. As they queued to make their personal pledges, a man called Al-Abbas ibn Ubadah stopped them, saying, Do you know what you are pledging to this man? You are committing yourselves to go to war against the whole world. If there is any doubt in your minds, or if you feel that if your wealth is looted and your honored leaders are killed, you will give him up, it is more honorable for you to leave him alone now. Giving him up in such an eventuality will dishonor you in both this life and the life to come. If, on the other hand, you feel you will honor your commitments, come what may, then go ahead, because this will increase your honor in both this world and the next. They all said without hesitation, We are committed, come what may. The question they were naturally keen to put to the Prophet was, What will our reward be if we honor our commitments? The Prophet's answer came in a single word, paradise. Then they all shook hands with the Prophet in a gesture concluding the deal. They asserted that they would never seek release from their commitments, nor would they accept any cancellation. A few points should be made here in connection with this meeting. Firstly, the fact that Al-Abbas, the Prophet's uncle who was still at that time following pagan beliefs, was present may suggest to some people that Muslims may take non-Muslims into their confidence, even in the most serious matters which affect their community. The Quran indeed warns against this and advises us to be on guard. We must remember that Al-Abbas was the Prophet's own uncle, and the Prophet knew for certain that he wished him and his followers well. Furthermore, Al-Abbas was an interested party. As a leading figure of the Hashemite clan, which was responsible for the protection of Muhammad, peace be upon him, he needed to be sure that the Medina people were serious in taking over this responsibility. Secondly, it was clear at the meeting that the two parties knew very well what was involved in making that covenant. The Prophet spelled out what sort of protection he required. The speakers from the other side made it absolutely clear to their fellow delegates that they were effectively taking on the whole world. When they made their commitment, therefore, they made it with their eyes open. Thirdly, the reward the Medina Muslims were promised for their fulfillment of their part of the deal had nothing to do with this world. They were not told that they would be given so many ministries in the government of the state, or that the Prophet's successor would be one of them. Indeed, they were promised what every Muslim who serves his faith with tireless dedication and devotion is promised: admittance to heaven. This promise helps always to keep those who work for Islam on the right track. Their motives remain pure, and their goal is always the same: to earn the pleasure of God. They do not seek any worldly reward, and they do not have any personal ambitions, not even that the victory of Islam should come about through their own efforts. They leave such matters to God. He alone determines when and through whose efforts his call achieves victory. The advocates of Islam know that their task is to work for that victory, but what happens to them is immaterial, for their dedication and tireless efforts are sure to bring them their most precious reward, the pleasure of God and paradise. When everyone at the meeting had given his personal pledge, the Prophet asked them to select from among them 12 representatives who would be in charge of the Muslims in Medina. The selected 12 were Asad ibn Zurara, Sa'd ibn al-Rabi, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, Rafi ibn Malik, Al-Bara ibn Marur, Abdullah ibn Amr, Ubadah ibn al-Samit, Sa'd ibn Ubadah, and Al-Mundhir ibn Amr ibn Khunas, all of whom belonged to the tribe of Khazraj. The remaining 3, Usaid ibn Hudayr, Sa'd ibn Khitama, and Rifa' ibn al-Mundhir, were of the Aus tribe. The Quraysh learns of the meeting. It was unlikely that a meeting of this size in an open place like Aqaba would remain secret. Before it was over, a loud voice was heard shouting, "There is Muhammad, peace be upon him, meeting with those who have deserted their religion." The Prophet told his new allies, whom we shall now call by their Islamic name, Al-Ansar, meaning the supporters, to go back to their tents. Under the cover of darkness, they dispersed quietly, thanking God for enabling them to conclude their business with the Prophet. None of them was missed by his people during his absence at the meeting. The shouting, however, was enough to betray the secret. When morning broke, the Quraysh learned enough about the meeting to prompt immediate action. They undertook intensive inquiries about what had happened. Their investigation led them in the right direction. A group of their leaders therefore went to the camp of the Medina pilgrims and said, "We have learnt that you have been in contact with our man and that you have requested him to join you in your city and pledged to fight us alongside him. Now we want to assure you that you are the last people with whom we want to have a fight." The non-believers among the Medina group, and there were quite a few of them, were quick to deny the whole story. They assured the Meccans that they had no knowledge of any contact or meeting between their people and Muhammad, peace be upon him. Their denials were, of course, true. They were kept in ignorance of the whole affair, a fact which suggests that the Prophet and the Muslims viewed their developing relationship and its prospects very seriously and realized that they must tread very carefully if they were to turn a new page in the history of Islam. The Muslims from Medina simply kept quiet as this conversation between non-believers from Mecca and Medina went on. One man of high standing in Medina, Abdullah ibn Ubay, who was to have an unhappy relationship with Islam, reassured the Quraysh delegation, "This is indeed a very serious matter. My people would not keep me in ignorance of it, should the whole thing be in their minds. I simply have no knowledge that such a thing has taken place, so I must assume that it has not." Reassured, the Meccans went back home. But a couple of days later, when the pilgrims set off on their return journey, the suspicions of the Quraysh were confirmed. They sent some squads to chase the Medina people. They could do no more than seize 2 men, Al-Mundhir ibn Amr and Sa'd ibn Ubadah, who were among the 12 leaders of the Muslim group. Al-Mundhir managed to escape, but Sa'd was taken prisoner. His hands were tied to his neck, and he was dragged back to Mecca. They kept beating him and pulling his thick hair. As the torture continued, one man who felt sorry for Sa'd whispered in his ear, "Have you ever had any covenant or dealing with anyone from the Quraysh?" Sa'd replied, "Yes, indeed. I have always protected the trade caravans of Jubair ibn Mutim and Al-Harith ibn Harb, ensuring that they came to no harm in our parts." The man said, "Then shout their names aloud and mention your friendship with them." This man, Abu al-Bakhtari ibn Hisham, went quickly looking for Jubair and Al-Harith. He found them in the mosque and told them, "I have just come from Al-Abda, where I saw a man from Al-Khazraj being badly beaten. He kept shouting both your names and saying that you have an agreement of mutual protection with him." When they realized that it was Sa'd who was being tortured, they quickly went and saved him from his tormentors. That, however, was all that the Quraysh could do about the new covenant between the Muslims from Medina and the Prophet. The agreement was concluded and sealed, marking the beginning of a new stage in the history of Islam, which was to be totally different from the stage that was coming to its close. Shortly afterwards, the Prophet advised his followers in Mecca to emigrate to Medina. He said, "God has provided you with a new home and new brethren." They started to leave in small groups secretly so that they would not be stopped by the Meccans. The Prophet himself stayed on in Mecca waiting for God's permission to leave. Within a few weeks, the majority of the Meccan Muslims had settled in Medina. Only those who were physically prevented from making the trip were left behind, along with the Prophet, Abu Bakr, and Ali. Abu Bakr indeed sought the Prophet's permission to go, but the Prophet asked him to delay his departure, giving him a significant hint. God may provide you with a companion.